A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. In this video, we will inshallah see how the earliest Muslims used to perform salah. Because the oldest book that we have is the Quran. Before all the hadith books, before all the madhahib, before the Khawarij, before the Shias, before all the sects, how did the Quran actually describe salah? Because, first came these sects like the Khawarij and the Shias, and they altered the salah, and then they came the Umayyads who were Murji'ah, and then the Abbasids with their madhahib, with their, the so-called four madhabs of today, although there were more than four, there were like 10 or more in the past. Before all these differences regarding how to perform salah, and there are many contradictions between these groups, and not just between these groups, but there are many contradictions in the hadith books regarding salah that no one follows today. So aside from the differences between the Malikis and the Shafi'is and the Hanafis and the Hanbalis and the Ibazis and the 12 Imam Shias and the Ismaili Shias, etc., aside from these differences, there are also many differences within each madhab, and also there are contradictory ahadith that are classed as authentic, yet no one actually follows them today. No sect and no school of thought follows those ahadiths today. But I actually made the mistake over 2 years ago when I demonstrated the salah, and at that time I was still basing my salah partly on hadith, meaning that I was following certain ahadith that no one else today follows, and that's why I perform salah in that way. But the real salah is, although it's actually very similar to how I performed the salah over 2 years ago, but the real salah is actually only in the Quran. It is not based on anything else. It is not based on hadith, the riwayat of the Ahlul Bayt, the Salaf, the Sahaba. It's only in the Quran. And the proof that it has to be entirely based on the Quran is that it actually says, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, فَإِذَا أَمِنْتُمْ فَاسْكُرُوا اللَّهَ كَمَا عَلَّمَكُمْ مَا لَمْ تَكُونُوا تَعْلَمُونَ. It says, after you are safe, first it says perform the salah, and then it says if you're afraid of being in danger, then after you are safe, remember Allah the way Allah taught you. And this is not a controversial interpretation. This is actually a very common interpretation, and it's very obvious from the text. And even Ibn Kathir says this. I mean, even Tafsir Ibn Kathir, which is the standard tafsir, says that here the word dhikr is referring to salah. And it's very obvious from the context, because it's talking about salah, and then it says, after you're safe, remember Allah the way that Allah has taught you. So the word dhikr here means salah, and because the word dhikr can actually mean many things depending on the context. It literally means to remember, and in the context of religion it means to remember Allah. So mentioning Allah's names is a form of dhikr, but salah itself is a form of dhikr, and the Quran actually refers to itself as dhikr. So the Quran says we will protect this dhikr. So the Quran actually says that Allah will protect the Quran, but it refers to the Quran as dhikr. So we all, pretty much all of us, anyone with any kind of logic and even a little bit of logic, can agree that dhikr means salah. It's very clear in this context. In the context of this ayah, dhikr means salah. Now why is that important? Because it says perform salah the way He, meaning Allah, taught you. Now why is that very important? Because it does not say perform salah the way the messenger taught you, or the way the prophet taught you, or the way the hadith taught you, or the way the ulul amr taught you, or the way your imams taught you. It says perform the salah the way Allah has taught you. Okay, why is that very important? Because, let me ask you this, how do we respond to someone who says, I only believe in the Quran, I do not believe in the hadith, I do not believe in the Sunnah? Why should they believe in the Hadith? Why should they believe in the Sunnah? Why should they not entirely base their religion on the Quran? Why shouldn't we do that? Our response is that, look, the Quran itself says obey Allah and obey the Messenger. Since obeying Allah obviously means to obey the words of Allah, meaning the Quran, then obey the Messenger means obey the words of the Messenger, which is what we call Hadith or Sunnah today. And they respond by saying that no, obey Allah and obey the messenger means obey the messenger by obeying Allah. So they see that these are both the same things. Obey Allah means obey the Quran, and obey the messenger also means obey the Quran. Now that's a very ridiculous interpretation, because then why doesn't the Quran simply say just obey the Quran instead of saying obey Allah and obey the messenger? The fact that it says and shows that these are two sources. What's interesting, however, is that the people who follow hadith, the people who follow the madhabs, the four madhabs, and the Salafis, and the Maturidis, the Ash'aris, the Mu'tazilis, etc., the hadith followers are also interpreting the Quran in a similar way as them, but in like the other way around. Meaning that if obey Allah means obey the Quran, and obey the messenger means obey the hadith, then doesn't that mean remember Allah the way Allah taught you means remember Allah the way the Quran taught you? Remember, we already established that obey Allah means obey the Quran, and obey the messenger means obey the hadith or sunnah. But in this ayah it says perform the salah, meaning it says fazkurullah, but as I explained, it's very obvious that dhikr here is referring to salah, and as I said, this is not even a controversial issue. So if dhikr here is referring to salah, then it is saying perform the salah the way Allah taught you. What does that mean? Allah taught you. What are the words of Allah? The Quran. So perform the salah the way the Quran taught you. So this proves that our salah must be entirely based on the Quran. Our salah the entire salah is in the Quran. Everything about the salah is in the Quran. Now, of course, some tricksters, some jokers, some deceivers will come up and say, oh yeah, it's all in the Quran, but it requires a mystical interpretation. A lot of Shias and Sufis especially will make this claim. And even some of the Salafis will make similar claims. But the Quran itself tells us that the meaning of the Quran is clear, and it also tells us that it's not poetry. So the fact that the Quran is clear shows that the salah must be clearly described in the Quran. And saying otherwise is contradicting the Quran. And if you contradict the Quran, then that means you don't really believe in it. You really believe in those other books, whatever it is that you believe in, whether you're a Shia or a Sufi or a Salafi or a whatever ideology you have. You are actually defending your ideology. If you really believe in the Quran tells us to read it, think about it, not to blindly follow other people, but to think about it, and that it is not poetry or poetic, and it's not some kind of poetic mystical thing that only a few people can understand. The Quran is clear, and we are all supposed to follow the Quran. And since the Quran is clear, then the salah must be clearly described in the Quran. And no hadith can add anything to the Quran. This is very important. Anything, any addition, any hadith that says, oh, and also do this, add this to your salah, say this also, or even a hadith that is quoting from the Quran, like it says, say this ayah in your salah, those ahadiths are also fabricated, because the Quran is clear, and therefore the meaning of the Quran is clear, so it must be in context. So we don't need a hadith to take the Quran out of context and tell us that you randomly place this hadith, this ayah in your salah. No, the Quran is clear, therefore the salah is clearly described in the Quran, and your Lord is not forgetful. See, I'm not someone who rejects all hadith. I'm saying that regarding salah, not regarding everything, regarding certain issues such as salah, we must take our religion only entirely from the Quran. And the only thing the hadith can say is to go into more detail, but they cannot add anything. They cannot say, oh, and also do this, and also do this movement, and also say these words. It must be directly from the Quran. Otherwise, it would have said, perform salah the way Allah and His Messenger taught you. But no, it says, perform salah the way Allah taught you. But I must warn you right now that there are many bad English translations of the Quran. Not just English, but in many languages. There are many bad translations that are completely mistranslating the words at the end of this ayah. But in Arabic, it's actually very clear. You can ask any Arabic person, or you can learn Arabic yourself. Even if you know a little bit of Arabic, it's very clear that kama means as the way that Allah taught you. But for example, in some of these translations, you see that it says, since it is He who taught you. But in the Arabic, there is no since. It does not say since Allah taught you. It says kama. Kama means as Allah taught you. And another translation says, take time to remember Allah for teaching you what you did not know. Again, it does not say for. It doesn't say since. It doesn't say for. And then the other translation says, and remember God when you are safe again, because it is He who has taught you. Again, the Arabic doesn't say because. All these translations are completely false, and there are many false translations, but there are also some good translations. As I said, this is not even a controversial issue. I mean, I don't think any Arabic speaking person would even doubt what I'm saying as far as the meaning of the end of the ayah is concerned, because in Arabic it's very clear, but some of the translations are just so out of context, and so, I mean, they're not even really translations, they're just making things up. But for example, if you look at Aisha Buli's translation, it actually almost exactly 100% correct. It says, remember Allah in the way He taught you. And that's actually what it says in Arabic. Kama means in the way, as, or in the way. It does not mean any of those other words. So be careful. If you don't understand Arabic, be careful, because there are lots and lots of really bad translations. And I don't know if these bad translations are deliberate, like they're part of some kind of satanic conspiracy, or if these people just made mistakes and they just didn't care to translate accurately. But regardless, try to find a literal translation, or at least a relatively good translation, or try to learn at least a little bit of Arabic, because I'm telling you, kama does not mean since or because. It simply doesn't mean that at all. And furthermore, the reason why there are all these, contradictions regarding how to perform salah, and many differences of opinion, and that, these debates have gone on for so many years between the Malikis, the Shafis, the Hanafis, the Hanbalis, and sometimes between people within the same madhab. So you got Salafis who put their hands in the middle of the chest, and you got Salafis who put their hands on the chest but not in the middle, and they do it similar to the Shafis. And you got differences among Malikis as well. Some Malikis perform salah, many Malikis perform salah similar to the Shias and Khawarij, but there are some Malikis who actually put their hands together as well. So there are numerous contradictions, and they have written so many books about this. And the Salafis often claim that only their salah is based on authentic narrations. But I used to think that, and I used to perform salah like similar to the Salafis about 10 years ago. But then I read some Hanafi books that were actually refuting the Salafis and showing that they also have authentic narrations for how to perform salah. And they were also showing that some hadith scholars have denied the authenticity of the ahadith that the Salafis use, and that some people have actually criticized those narrations in Sahih Bukhari or other books that the Salafis take their salah from. So this is actually a very complex issue, and if I just sit here and tell you about all the differences and contradictions, we'll be here all day, because there are many books written about this, and this has been going back and forth. Different groups of people refuting each other. Hanafis refuting the Shafis refuting the Salafis refuting the Malikis, and so on. And the reason behind all this, and these are just Ahl Sunnah. I'm not even talking about the Khawarij and the Shia sects, and there are many Shia sects as well. They got the 12 Imami Shias, the Ismaili Shias, the Nusaybi Shias, etc. You know what the difference is behind all this? Because they're not following what the Quran actually says. And if you tell them this, they will quote to you a hadith that is very famous, and it's in both Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, unfortunately. And it says, perform salah as you have seen me doing it. Now, compared to what the Quran says, perform salah the way Allah taught you. But this hadith says, perform salah the way the messenger taught you, basically. That's what he's saying. So this hadith is contradicting the Quran, although obviously I'm not saying that the way the Prophet performed salah was incorrect. Obviously the Prophet performed the salah correctly, but what I'm saying is that the reason why the vast majority of the ahadith about salah are actually fabricated, including the ones that are classed as sahih by some, although they're denied, they're rejected by others. As I said, some of the Hanafis say that certain ahadith in Sahih Bukhari are not actually sahih. So the reason behind all these controversies is because people are saying that we have to follow the Prophet, and so we have to look at what the hadith says about salah, and most of the debates and arguments about salah are based mostly or entirely on hadith and not on the Quran. Because unfortunately the Quran is treated today as an abrogated book. You know how the Torah, the Zabur and the Injil are abrogated, even the original ones. Even if we had the original Torah or the Injil or the Zabur, they would be abrogated by the Quran. But unfortunately the four madhabs and the Shias and many other sects believe that the Quran has been abrogated by hadith. So for them, the Quran is not the final revelation. For them, the hadith are the final revelation, because they say that the hadith abrogates the Quran. And they have no evidence for this from the Quran, because the Quran says an ayah abrogates another ayah. And even that is referring to the Quran abrogating the previous scriptures. But they claim that no, hadith can also abrogate an ayah. And their only evidence for this are hadith. The Quran never says that a hadith can abrogate an ayah. So the very definition of abrogation is not in the Quran at all. So that is why they are performing salah in all these different ways, and there are so many more contradictions, even more contradictions if you read the hadith books. Now obviously, as I said, the Prophet used to perform the salah correctly. So you may be asking, so how come we don't have hadith from the Prophet describing the salah? Because the Prophet didn't need to describe the salah. You see, the Quran says, perform salah the way Allah taught you. Now why would the Prophet try to add something to it, or try to... It's because the Quran is clear, and so anyone who believes that the Quran is the word of Allah and that is clear as it says it is, and that we must obey it as it says we must obey it, and we must think about what it says as it says so. Not as the Sufi sheikhs say that no, we'll do the thinking and you just blindly follow us. Not as the Shia so-called ayatollahs and the sheikhs of the Shias say, no, we're going to just tell you what to do and you have to blindly do taqleed from us. No, we must take our religion from the Quran, and the Prophet knew this, so the Prophet had no need to describe the salah any further. The Prophet didn't need to tell us how to perform the salah, because if you're a mu'min, if you're a believer, you would follow the Quran. And the Prophet used to perform salah as the Quran teaches. So yes, the way the Prophet performed the salah was correct, but the reason why we have so many ahadiths that are false is that none of the early Muslims had any need to narrate hadith from the Prophet about how to perform salah, because the hadith of the Prophet regarding salah is simply the Quran. The Quran is the best hadith, and when the answer is already in the Quran, we don't need hadith. Just as in the case of where to place your hands for salah, why are there so many contradictions about where to place our hands? As I said before, on the navel or on the chest or in the middle of the chest or on our flanks, etc. Although regarding the there's no hadith about the flanks, but some people say that the people of Medina did it that way. Although there were a lot of crypto Jews in Medina. But that's why the Malikis say you have to perform salah in that way, similar to the Shias and the Khawarij. So we have all these things, but none of these are in the Quran. So all of these contradictions are actually the work of shaitan. All of these contradictory ahadith are the work of shaitan. And everyone wants to say, no, our ahadith are correct. It's the other madhab who are doing it wrong. Their ahadith are incorrect. They are following false ahadith. But what if they're all following false hadith? Because the Quran only tells us how to perform salah. So it was unnecessary for there to even be any hadith about how to perform the salah when it's already clearly described in the Quran. And if you're worried that many people may not accept the real salah, just read the Quran. The Quran tells us about that there are people, there are munafiqeen, there are kuffar and munafiqeen, who when you recite to them the Quran, they behave as if they didn't even hear it. And that's precisely how many of these sects behave. If you tell them, look, the Quran says perform salah in this way, they don't care. They don't even care what the Quran says. They don't even care what you quoted or recited from the Quran to them. They only recite the Quran for blessings. They think that they will get some magical blessings by reciting certain verses. But they believe that it is forbidden to actually follow it, because they believe the Quran has been abrogated by hadith. And that's actually the least corrupt among them, the people who call themselves Ahl Hadith. But the other groups are even worse. They say that no, we don't even need hadith, we just follow the Shaykh. At least the Salafis or Ahl Hadith take their religion mostly from hadith, although the Salafis also take much of the religion from the Salaf, from the Tabi'in, from the early generations, from the narrations about the early generations, which is another problem itself. But then we got people who say, no, we just follow the so-called Ayatollah. The Shias who say we just do taqleed of the so-called Ayatollah, just follow the Sufi Sheikh. So when you recite to them the Quran, they behave as if they didn't hear it. And so the Quran says, promise such people a painful punishment. So you don't need to be worried about people who won't listen, because these are the people of Jahannam. The people who don't care, the people who just turn away when you recite to them the Quran, when you quote to them the Quran, looks, the Quran says perform salah in this way. I don't care. Shut up. Those people are munafiqeen. They are not Muslims. They are the people of Jahannam. Don't be deceived by them. So don't think that you have to win over their consent. And so you might be asking now, so where in the Quran is the salah clearly described? In more than one place, but there is one place in particular where the salah is mostly described. And that's in the 17th surah. And that is actually how I performed salah before. I performed salah based on these ayat. But I also did certain things that are not in the Quran. And those things that I did were wrong. And inshallah, I will go into that on future videos about why I was wrong and where did I get my evidence from in the past and how I came to the conclusion that I shouldn't be doing those things anymore. But the salah is actually described from beginning to end at the end of the 17th surah of the Quran. It actually tells us what to do. And if the reason why no one pays attention to this, and no one except me perform salah as described here, is because it's so different from the way every madhab and every sect teaches their followers. There are so many different contradictions between what the Quran says regarding salah and what they say, and so they ignore it even though it's clearly stated that this is referring to salah. For example, it says prostrate on your chins. Who does that? No one except me. And those who agreed with my previous video about salah. None of these groups do it. The Malikis, Shafis, Hanafis, Hanbalis, Khawarij, Ibazis, Shias, whatever. No sect prostrates on their chin, even though the Quran says prostrate on your chin. No sect says Subhana Rabbina in kana wa'adu Rabbina lamaf'ula in their salah. They say other things. They say Subhana Rabbiyal A'la or Subhana Rabbiyal Azim or Subhana Rabbiyal Azim wa hamdih, etc. And they say the tashahhud, etc. But the Quran actually tells us to say these things. The Quran actually tells us exactly what to say, and no one says these things. Almost no one in the world says these things. And the Quran also says, do not raise your voice in salah and do not be silent. Yet there are many of these groups who say that you have to be silent in your salah. They literally do the opposite of what the Quran says. The Quran literally says, don't raise your voice and don't be loud and don't be silent. But they say, no, you have to be silent. Now the main reason these people may reject this salah that is clearly described in the Quran is that they say this is referring to the people of the book, so they mistranslate and misinterpret this in the tafsir books as well, not just in the English translations, but in the tafsir books. They say in الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْعِلْمِ means Ahlul Kitab, even though that's not what it says. The Quran, you see, the Quran means to say exactly what it says. The Quran actually says there is no substitute for Allah's words. So when Allah says something, He means exactly that. So the Quran is actually saying, you know what these words mean? For those of you who don't understand any Arabic, it says those who have been given the knowledge. And yet this is translated and interpreted, even in Arabic, is falsely interpreted as people of the book, the Jews and the Christians. So they claim that this is how the Jews and the Christians perform Salah. Now here's our number of problems. First of all, there is no Jew or Christian in the world who performs Salah in this way. That's the first problem. Secondly, it says those who have been given the knowledge. And you know that the word ilm or knowledge is referring to, the true knowledge, the correct knowledge. So those who have the correct knowledge, those who have the real knowledge, not these people who claim to be ulama, not these Sufi sheikhs and Shia so-called ayatollahs, these ayatul dajjals, not the Saudi sheikhs. The people who, if you want to know who has the ilm, who has the real ilm, it is those who perform salah in this way. The people who have knowledge, the people who have the correct knowledge, are those who perform salah in this way. That's what the Quran is saying. And yet they twist it and say, no, this means the Jews and the Christians. So the Jews and the Christians are the people of knowledge. And why is the Quran describing the salah of the Jews and the Christians in such detail, but not the salah of the Muslims? It doesn't make any sense at all. So that's not what it says at all in Arabic. And it makes no sense. But the munafiqeen, they don't care. They don't care what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. They just turn away and they say, my sheikh said this word means something else. Because the Quran is poetic and only the mystical sheikhs can understand it. Only so and so can understand it. We should just leave our brain behind and do not do any thinking or contemplation. Even though the Quran says you have to think while reading the Quran. You're supposed to read it and think. But they say that no, we're not allowed to think. We just follow the interpretation of our sheikhs. Inshallah, we will continue this on part 2 of this video.